Hello and welcome to another episode of InIIS Insights, the podcast of the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen. My name is Roy Karadak. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and the academic director of the institute. Today we will be addressing the US naval deployment in the Caribbean and the US attacks on boats in these waters, all happening in the self-proclaimed war against drugs coming into North America by these naval routes. These attacks are primarily directed against the government of Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro, who has for quite some time now been targeted as one of the main enemies of the United States. Threats are made directly to go against Maduro and to coerce the state of Venezuela to comply with the Trump administration, also to begin striking targets within the country itself and to even invade eventually, all framed as part of a policy in which Maduro is considered the head of a narco-terrorist group. The buildup is massive, including an aircraft carrier. This is, of course, all very troubling and particularly distressful for the population of Venezuela, many of whom feel trapped and exposed to a politics of escalation that one cannot really conceive of rationally. So how to make sense of this and whether to expect another Trumpian war without any decision made by US Congress and without any sort of declaration of war, at least so far, is the aim of this session today. And for this, we are very happy to have a guest with us who is more than capable of helping us out in all this. That would be Phil Gunson, who's a senior analyst for the Andes region at the ICG, the International Crisis Group. He is based in the capital Caracas and has written extensively on these attacks and the military escalation between the US and Venezuela. Just to mention two more recent pieces that were both published on November 21st, one in the New York Times called "I'm in Venezuela. This is the true cost of Trump's gunboat diplomacy," and the other one in Foreign Affairs titled "The Peril of Ousting Maduro." It is great to have you, Phil, with us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start this way. Relations between the US and Venezuela had already soured over these past decades already. Now, how do Venezuelans perceive the current war threats by the US government? How did the attacks in the Caribbean and these threats change the political atmosphere in Venezuela, and especially in which way do they challenge the government on the one hand, and in which way the major opposition figures, some of whom had already been quite open to some sort of US intervention in these past months and years?
Yes, well, I think the first thing to say is that it's very difficult to get a sense of public opinion here because although there is polling, there are public opinion polls that are taken in Venezuela since the election last year, which of course Nicolas Maduro stole after Edmundo González, the opposition candidate, won it by a large margin. Since then, the polling companies haven't wanted to publicize their findings for fear of government reprisals. So we don't have very much in the way of statistics to back up what I'm going to say. But I think it's fair to say that there's a wide range of opinions. I mean, there are certainly a lot of people in Venezuela and a lot of Venezuelans outside of Venezuela, of course, who would like to see an end to the Maduro regime, however it happens. And they're prepared to take a certain amount of short-term pain in order to put an end to what has been an increasingly undemocratic regime over the past couple of decades, and one which has created a terrible humanitarian emergency in Venezuela. So a lot of people really just want it to be over, and if the US feels the need to bomb somebody or something, then they're fine with that. Then, of course, there are a lot of people on the government side who are very wary and nervous about the prospect, not only because some of them might be targeted directly by the US, but if there is regime change, then of course there are a lot of people who would lose their jobs, some people who might fear revenge attacks by people who feel that over the past quarter century they've been unfairly discriminated against, that they've been persecuted. So there's a wide range of feelings, and I think in the middle you have a large number of Venezuelans who feel rather helpless in the face of all this. This is a battle between Maduro and Trump, or between the US and Venezuelan governments, but ordinary Venezuelans, there's very little they can do about it. They have to sit and wait and see what happens. And of course, we feel increasingly isolated from the world because due to the fact that airlines have been advised not to fly into Venezuela, and some have taken a decision on their own because it's a hazardous environment and navigation systems are not working properly. So we're really rather cut off from the world right now, and waiting to see what happens.
Just out of curiosity, have there been any arrests in these past weeks of people who were explicitly for some sort of US intervention and even for attacks on Venezuela?
Well, there certainly have been arrests ever since the election, and those arrests haven't stopped, of people associated with Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader, and her party, Vente Venezuela, her movement, I suppose we should call it, because the government has never allowed it to be registered as a party. And also other people. Just recently, a leading trade unionist was kidnapped, and I use the term advisedly because when the government picks up political opponents, dissidents in this country, they don't tend to use the rule of law. There is no due process. You are generally speaking kidnapped either from home or off the street and taken to an unknown location, not allowed access to lawyers, not given any form of due process. So this is the kind of thing that's happening, and it keeps on happening. There have been one or two releases as well in recent weeks, rather few, but it all goes to make up this overall system which the Venezuelan government is applying, which some people call the revolving door. So they pick up some people, they release others, but nobody is given a fair trial. You are left in jail until the government feels like releasing you. So the persecution definitely continues.
Mm. So we cannot really establish how big domestic support for Maduro is, even in light of these threats expressed by the U.S. government. And then it's tricky to tell what the regional support could be for, maybe not for Maduro, but against a an immediate U.S. attack or intervention. So, how about this regional politics in which Venezuela is embedded? So, is there any visible effort to diplomatically counter these U.S. threats?
Well, yes, the two most important neighbors of Venezuela, Colombia and Brazil, the two big countries, Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, are both headed by left-wing presidents, left-wing governments. And although they're not like the government of Venezuela in the sense that they were democratically elected. They have both tried to influence Maduro rather than simply confronting him. They both tried to persuade Maduro to take a more democratic path. They tried to mediate in the aftermath of the election. Presidents Petro of Colombia and Lula of Brazil. Petro has been very vocal against Trump and everything that he's been doing in the last few months against the Venezuelan government. Petro is very fervently opposed to the U.S. military um, deployment in the Caribbean, and indeed, it's a deployment which, to a degree, actually threatens Colombia as well. I mean, Trump has in recent days spoken. He's called Petro himself a leading drug trafficker. He's suggested that he might bomb Colombian territory. Colombia is, of course, the world's biggest producer of cocaine. Almost all the world's cocaine comes from Colombia. President Lula has been more diplomatic, but he's also opposed to the deployment of the fleet. He's spoken about it at the United Nations General Assembly. He's tried to talk directly to Trump about it. Neither of them appear to have had much success in persuading Trump to do things a different way. And then there's a whole range of regional governments on the right who have many of them being very supportive. They've done things like echoing the US decision to declare the so-called narco-terrorist cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, which the US says Maduro heads, to declare it a terrorist organization, to basically copy US policy and to express support for Trump. It's impossible to tell, from what their public statements are, whether they genuinely believe what the US says or whether it's simply a way of ingratiating themselves with the Trump government.
Is it not tricky for these more right governments who are pro-Trump to tolerate these, military incursions into these waters?
I think it could be, I mean, in terms of the domestic politics of each country. But it really does vary from one place to another. And one of the things I think is worth pointing out is that in doing this to the Maduro government, in arraying this enormous fleet in the Caribbean, in threatening Maduro with essentially with being deposed with military intervention on a large scale, Trump has picked a good target in the sense that Maduro is not popular. I mean, he's not only not popular with Venezuelans, but he's not popular in the region, even with governments of the left, with the exception of fellow dictatorships like Nicaragua and Cuba. Maduro is widely repudiated on all ends of the political spectrum, and so whilst some governments are vocal in their opposition to what Trump is doing, most of them probably wouldn't be too sorry if Maduro were simply removed from power, assuming that that could be done in a way that would avoid creating even more chaos and instability than is already the case.
Maybe on this, I mean, what in your impression, what post-war visions or post-regime change visions of Venezuela are floating within the US administration on which they may act now? I mean, within the conservative and the far-right US circles, which are also very different in their in what their foreign policy interests are.
Yes, I think the worrying thing is that there is no clarity on what they think is going to happen on the day after, assuming that they achieve their apparent goal of deposing Maduro, causing his government to collapse. Um, and I say it's worrying because it's one thing to pursue regime change in the sense of a gradual transition from what is now an open dictatorship to a more democratic regime. And it's another to simply create power vacuum, to remove a government without a clear plan as to what to do next. It's true that there is a government in waiting. There is a president elect who was chosen by the voters of Venezuela by, as I say, a very large margin, Edmundo González, currently in exile in Spain. Um, and the opposition under Maria Corina Machado assures us that they have a detailed plan of what to do if they're able to take power. Um, but at the same time, history teaches us that if you're going to do this kind of thing and achieve some kind of peaceful handover of power, you really need to have a very considerable armed force to back it up. Because otherwise, what you have is violent chaos. And it may be the case, it is the case, that Venezuela is not Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan. That's all true. I mean, Venezuela is a much more homogeneous country. It's not a country with, a long history of sectarian violence or separatist movements or ethnic or religious tensions. That's all true. However, it is a country in which there are a very large number of people with guns, something like 6 million estimated guns in civilian hands. We have an array of non-state armed groups, all of them with a very clear incentive to resist the removal of the present government, to resist the installation of any regime that would seek to install the rule of law and control territory, because they're making a lot of money out of the absence of rule of law, out of their various criminal activities. And principal among them, is the ELN, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, which has several thousand well armed and well trained and battle hardened combatants inside Venezuela sworn to defend the Maduro government, or as they would probably say, the Bolivarian revolution. So the idea that you're somehow going to have a smooth transition once you've deposed the present regime to functioning democracy, I think, is to overlook the real obstacles that lie in the path.
Mm. How about anti-government armed groups? Are there any operating who for whom this could be a viable thing and with whom you could repeat episodes of the 80s in which the United States sponsored them to attack or to go to war with in civil wars against any of these governments in Central America?
No, is the short answer. I mean, there have been attempts, rather uh, small scale, incompetent attempts by different elements of the opposition to produce some kind of change via, I wouldn't even say armed struggle. I mean, on one occasion, Maduro was attacked with drones. It failed completely. There was a very pathetic attempt to invade the country with a few um, ex-Venezuelan soldiers and US mercenaries. There have been coup plans, coup plots of various kinds over the years, but I think the only way that you would actually have something approaching a civil war would be if the army itself, if the armed forces were to split into pro-change and pro-regime factions. And the worrying thing is, again, that this appears to be part of the US strategy. In other words, what Washington is seeking is precisely to create these fissures, these cracks in the military in order to remove Maduro from power. Now, the problem there is that the best way to start a civil war is to divide the armed forces against itself. I don't think a civil war in Venezuela as such would last very long. But what you could end up with would be one sort of protracted, low intensity war. And when I say protracted, I mean we could be looking at something that could last years, with, for example, selective assassinations and bombings and things because of all these armed groups that would have a strong incentive not only to resist Maduro's ouster, but also potentially to try to undermine and remove from power a democratic government that was installed thereafter.
Hmm. Let's go to the United States for a bit. I mean, with the more recent threats of even invading the country, how challenging is it in US politics for the president to actually wage a real war? I mean, there are countervailing forces even within his own constituency and especially within the Republican Party and maybe even the armed forces against this. So how tricky would it be for him to actually do this?
Yes, I think that's a major consideration for Donald Trump because, as we know, Trump is not particularly interested. I mean, he's certainly not interested in regime change. I mean, he's explicitly ruled that out as a plank of his policy. He certainly doesn't want to get involved in any kind of long-term military commitment to Venezuela. It's very doubtful if he's even willing to put, as the Americans like to say, boots on the ground in Venezuela to achieve the downfall of Maduro. And of course, for most people in the United States, Venezuela is a remote country of very little importance to them. I think most people in the US, even now, really would find it very hard to place Venezuela on a map. They don't know what's going on. They have no idea, what the politics is, what's involved. They may have a vague idea that Trump is trying to stop drugs entering the United States, which of course is a popular campaign, is a popular policy. But if it comes to actually putting US servicemen and women in harm's way, I think that would definitely cost Trump support. It'd be negative for him. And let's face it, Trump is already looking at a significant decline in his opinion poll ratings in recent months. He's facing midterm elections next year. Many of his policies are proving much less successful than the promises he made, particularly on the economic front. And so people are not looking to him to start a foreign war. And if he can perhaps say, well, we accomplished our mission in Venezuela, we've stopped drugs coming in from Venezuela, we can now move on to something else, that might well be a way out of what seems to be a very difficult situation for him. I think he's got himself into a situation where there aren't very many good options.
Mhm. Based on all our experiences with Trump in this past decade, uh, does it actually matter whether there is no clear rationale for this buildup? I mean, is it not enough for him that he is feared currently by most of these governments in the neighborhood?
Some of what he's doing is certainly aimed at sending messages to the wider region, particularly the Caribbean basin. I think Trump is nostalgic, if we can put it that way, for the kind of US power and influence, particularly in the Caribbean basin, that existed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when the US was free to intervene wherever it liked, to remove governments it didn't like, install governments that were more favorable. Trump perhaps doesn't see it quite in that way. He's not going to send in the Marines like presidents of that era would do, but he is prepared to use economic weapons. He is prepared to use military threats of various kinds, and even threats of annexation, as we've seen in the case of the threat to retake the Panama Canal, the threat to turn Canada into the 51st state, the threat to take over Greenland. These all may be rather fantastical ideas, but certainly the presence of a massive aircraft carrier and its strike group in the Caribbean, which is a really unprecedented situation, is not just about Venezuela. I think it's definitely about exerting US power in the Western Hemisphere, which the Trump administration feels has been neglected in recent decades. And to some extent, if we want to look at it in geopolitical terms, to some extent, although it's a long and interesting argument, to some extent, we're returning to an era of spheres of influence. And if that's the case, then the US sphere of influence, quite clearly, first and foremost, is the Americas. And I think people in the Trump administration feel that if they don't control what happens in the Americas, and if there are external, extra hemispheric actors like Russia and China and Iran meddling, as they would see it, in the Western Hemisphere, then that's something that needs to be combated. So as I say, it's not just about Venezuela.
Hmm. Dozens have been killed in these attacks against boats, some smaller, some larger, and there has been massive outcry in the region against these attacks, especially now that there's proof that many of these didn't have anything to do with importing drugs to the United States. So how how is this expressed? This anger of people in the region, not just in Venezuela, but in neighboring countries as well. And I don't know, is it tough at all to get rid of this discontent based on these killings and the opposition that this generates?
Well, sadly, I think there's not been nearly enough opposition to it. Certainly, there are people who are outraged, and I would include myself. I mean, I think these are clearly illegal attacks. These are, even if they are drug traffickers, and many of them may well be, in the sense that they are low-level drug traffickers who, for the most part, are not making much money out of it, and certainly their deaths don't contribute at all to any kind of genuine, coherent policy for curbing drug deaths in the United States. But really, we're talking about more than 80 people now. But of course, they're people that most Venezuelans have no idea who they were. Most of us don't know because, of course, the US has made it very difficult to detect, to find out who they were. And of course, also the Venezuelan government has made it very difficult because they're not really interested in anybody investigating exactly what's going on and what connections there may be to the Venezuelan military, for example. But then there are other nationals involved as well. I mean, there are Trinidadians, at least one Colombian or two Colombians, I think. There's an Ecuadorian guy, and we're starting to see some kind of pushback in the form of very incipient legal cases being brought. But overall, as I say, it seems to me that this is not what people are most worried about. I
Mm.
mean, they're most worried about, will Trump's efforts to overthrow Maduro work? If they don't, how long are we going to have to put up with this situation, which is making Venezuela, at least making our economic crisis worse, which is cutting us off from the world. So unfortunately, I think the fate of these people who've been murdered by the US, by US military on the high seas is not probably uppermost in most people's mind.
Mm. This buildup has been going on for 3 months now, starting in September. In the course of these months, how did the expectations change on what would happen now? I remember you saying, I guess, a couple of weeks ago on another podcast for the International Crisis Group that this may be some sort of escalation, but there will be some return to more transactional approaches. There will be some moderation, etc. How did your expectations on where this escalation would lead to change over these past weeks? I mean, this is all very uncertain what will happen next.
Yes, from the beginning, I think what we have seen and what we have the way we've been analyzing it, the way we've been interpreting it, is that knowing that Trump doesn't want to send troops to Venezuela, that he doesn't want to get involved in another country's conflict and risk a long-term US military commitment. We've seen this, and I think actually the Maduro government has seen it the same way, as fundamentally a bluff. It's based on the idea that enough pressure, enough saber rattling would ultimately lead to Maduro concluding that it's time to go, or would lead the military to overthrow him. Now, we've always thought from the beginning that that was a false premise because we feel that Maduro, unless it really comes to, the end game where there is an actual US invasion, or whether, where it comes to, targeted killings of people in the government, it seems to us that the calculation on the part of Maduro is, I'm always safer here in Venezuela. I'm going to continue to be safer here in Venezuela than anywhere else in the world. Um, and the military, whilst there may well be, and in fact, it's logical to suppose that there's a lot of discontent in the military, the risks to anybody trying to depose Maduro are very great. And we're talking about, obviously, certainly imprisonment and torture, possible death, persecution of your family members, confiscation of assets, and so on. The danger of getting it wrong is very severe. And all these people, any military officer who's in a sensitive position, who's in charge of a particularly important unit, whether it's an armored unit, whether it's part of the Air Force, whether it's the Marines, these people are really under very heavy surveillance. And so it's very difficult to imagine that somehow they're going to suddenly wake up one morning and say, we need to get rid of Maduro. So we've always felt that that was unlikely. And we've always felt that the escalation was not going to work. And as time has gone by, the different forms of escalation that we've seen have only convinced us of that. In other words, for example, halfway through, we see the US government suddenly say, well, we're going to bring an aircraft carrier from the Middle East or from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Caribbean. And that doesn't sound like the sort of thing that you would do if you already had a plan in mind. It's kind of improvised. It's like, well, you didn't believe us so far with what we've already deployed. We've got 4 destroyers and a submarine, and I don't know how many, 10 F-35 aircraft and so on. Well, maybe you'll believe us if we bring an aircraft carrier, but it doesn't look like a coherent military plan. So, in that sense, I don't think our perception of what's going on has changed that much. But what is the case, and again, we've been saying it from the beginning, is if you do this, if you issue these threats, explicit and implicit, then comes a point where you have put yourself in a position where you either have to do something if the threats haven't worked, or just go away, or
Mm.
find a way to say that it was a victory, and slowly demobilize. But I think that's where we're at now. I think the Trump administration has put itself in a difficult position. And I think that's why Trump is now talking to Maduro. I think they're looking for a way to extricate themselves from the situation they got themselves into.
Mm. Did anything really surprise you in these past weeks of these escalations?
I think, well, the aircraft carrier surprised me, and I didn't think they'd do that. Um, I, Other than that, not really. I think it's been a gradual process of trying to find the moment at which Maduro would give in. Um, and because we thought he never would, then it was logical to assume that they would keep on, they would insist on this build-up. I think what's interesting to analyze is what's going on within the US administration. And of course, I'm here, I'm not in Washington, but I talk to my colleagues there, I the press coverage and so on. And it does seem to me that, you know, um, there are significant differences between different groups in the administration, different individuals in the administration. And these differences, if the policy is seen to be failing, these differences will emerge. So it's quite possible that instead of causing the Venezuelan military to crack, that what this will do is it will cause the US administration to crack, at least in the sense of its Venezuela policy. We know that there are people in the administration who are very much opposed to this. Vice President J.D. Vance is not apparently in favor of what Marco Rubio is up to. And I think some of these people are simply waiting for the policy to fail so that they can say, I told you so, you should have listened to me in the first place.
Mm. Well, thank you. This was indeed very insightful to me, and I think also to the listeners here in Germany. And yeah, thank you for that, and all the best in these very troubling times, especially with you being there in Caracas. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing it when it goes live.
sure, will do. All right, bye, Phil. Thank you.
Bye for now.